the surgeries were probably an attempt to reroute the urethra, a difficult task even today. The 5-year-old patient was possibly awake and conscious throughout the operation, one that would have been easy enough to bungle.
Sickert himself often joked that he came to England to get circumcised, so he obviously was referring to a certain part of his anatomy.
Cornwell believes that Walter Sickert grew to manhood hiding a secret genital deformity, something unspeakable, so that ever since childhood, there was the public Walter Sickert and the private one. And Cornwell believes that in the summer of 1888, the private one took over.
That was the summer that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde opened on the London stage. And it was a sensation on stage and incredibly provocative in terms of getting people to talk about this very thing, about people looking like something they're not or being something they don't look like. Look at Bundy. He's a handsome guy. He cleaned up nice. Jeffrey Dahmer was a handsome guy, that if he were acting relatively normal, he didn't look like the sort who would drill holes in people's heads. That's the thing about human beings. We are not one thing.
2 months before Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde closed, someone picked up Martha Tabram and stabbed her 39 times. Cornwell thinks it was Walter Sickert, unleashing his own Mr. Hyde.
These types of killers, their violence usually escalates. It's like the child who gets tempted to steal the chewing gum at the cash register in the grocery store, and he thinks about it, and he looks at it every time he goes by, and then one day he does it.
It would make a lot of sense to me that Jack the Ripper would start not necessarily by disemboweling her, but by stabbing, getting some degree of comfort with his weapon.
Martha Tabram was last seen with a man in uniform.
We don't know that that was Jack the Ripper, but it was the last person she was seen with, and Sickert did have a fetish for uniforms.
3 weeks later, Polly Nichols had her throat slit, and the mutilations started.
This was the first murder of the series where Jack the Ripper's MO was really sort of on display. Some of her insides, I think part of her intestines, were actually exposed, but no organs were taken away.
Then came Annie Chapman, disemboweled, with some of her organs removed.
Annie Chapman was discovered with these horrible mutilations, and the incision to her throat was so deep that she was very nearly decapitated.
3 weeks later came the double event, where Catherine Eddowes had a kidney removed and her face carved up.
You have this progression of Jack the Ripper's victims, just the violence being committed on them is just increasing, almost exponentially.
And finally, a murder indoors, where the Ripper could take his time and Mary Kelly's heart.
Just killing the victim wasn't enough. He had to go beyond that, and he had to use his knife in a sexual way. He had to stab them multiple times. He had to cut their bodies open. He had to pull their internal organs out. He had to cut her breasts off. And so the behavior is coming from a much deeper source. It's coming from his mind, from his fantasies that he's been thinking about for 10, 15, 20 years.
With the killing of Mary Kelly, the Ripper murders presumably stopped. But Cornwell doesn't think that's what happened.
What your Ripper theorists tend to ignore, and the public ignored, and the police ignored back during the same period, is that torsos began to turn up. And these were not attributed to Jack the Ripper, but if you look at these particular cases, I don't know how you cannot think that perhaps Jack the Ripper might have been responsible.
Cornwell believes that Walter Sickert continued to kill people off and on for the next several years, if not decades. And she plans to keep looking for the hard scientific evidence that would prove it.
As long as science continues to give us new opportunities for revealing truth, as long as new evidence potentially comes in, this will always knock on my door, probably for the rest of my life. And I don't believe that you're an honorable person if you start something you don't finish.
But Cornwell skeptics aren't persuaded she's even remotely on the right track.
The whole of Patricia Cornwell's case, is a house built on sand, unfortunately, because her case solely rests on the fact that some or one of the letters must be genuinely from the killer. In fact, it's very likely every single letter we have, allegedly from Jack the Ripper, is a contemporary hoax. They weren't written by the killer at all.
It's doubtful we'll ever know what really happened during the Ripper's 3-month murder spree, or who the Ripper really was.
I'm not an optimist when it comes to identifying Jack the Ripper.
I've been looking at this case over 40 years. We will never know for sure who Jack the Ripper was.
Patricia Cornwell is only slightly more optimistic.
What ideally could happen is if somewhere in somebody's attic is something that Sickert saved at the time. You find an old bloody rag or part of a bloody piece of clothing, and you got the DNA from that, and you were able to compare it to one of the victims. That would be hitting gold, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
And while we wait for some miraculous breakthrough, we'll continue to be disturbed and fascinated by what took place in London's East End just over a century ago. We'll wonder if it was Robert Dunstan Stevenson creating a diabolical map, or Walter Sickert acting out some inner rage. Maybe the truth is a whole lot more humdrum than we'd like to think.
It was probably someone who lived in the East End, had a regular job, had maybe even a family. And if he wasn't suspected at the time, and if he was just an everyday person from the East End, his name is probably lost to history.